Well, noswaith dda iawn I chi gyd. A very good evening to you and a very warm welcome to the Drum and to the National Library of Wales. It's great to see so many of you here and we do have a treat in store. We have been promised. And in tonight's event we're delighted to welcome Dr. Paul O'Leary and Dr. Lucy Taylor who will be guiding us and discussing several themes that challenge this romantic view of a Wladfa'n, and of course, which is the topic of a book, which I'm sure they will mention during the course of the evening. In a few seconds, I will be transferring the reins over to Paul, but we will have a discussion, and then there will be some opportunities for questions. And I'd also like to remind those of you who are joining us online on Zoom that you're all obviously welcome to ask a question as well, and hopefully we'll be able to relay those questions over to Paul and to Lucy. So in the meantime, take a seat, sit back, relax, and over to you, Paul. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Give them a warm welcome. Diolch yn fawr.
Well, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at effectively the launch of this fantastic new book. I did mention it. Here's the title: Global Politics of Welsh Patagonia, Settler Colonialism from the Margins, by Dr. Lucy Taylor. Many congratulations, Lucy. This is part of a new book series by University of Wales Press. It's called Race, Ethnicity, Wales and the World. This is the second volume in the series. And it, I think, is obviously going to be a very important series. It already is, in rethinking some of the connections between Wales and the world in the past and today. So many congratulations, Lucy, on this tremendous book. You're a senior lecturer in international politics. You're an expert in Latin America. What was it that actually made you decide to spend time and effort, and probably a great deal of sweat too, researching a book on Welsh Patagonia?
Well, I think, can you hear me okay, everybody? I think before I answer that question, I'd just like to do a few thanks, if that's okay. Because if I don't, then I'll end up forgetting and I'll feel terrible. And I've even written them down so that I don't forget people, hopefully. First of all, and I will answer your question, Paul, I promise. The first one, I'd like to thank, of course, my husband and my son for being fantastic people to share my life with. Unfortunately, Arwyn can't be here tonight. He's not feeling very well. And Evan, I think, is probably going to go out and about. He's a student, so he may well not be listening. But if he is, that's fine. But if not, that's also fine. I'd like to also thank my lovely family, my beloved sisters and Rab and everybody else in the Taylor clan. And up at the back we have the Teulu Cymryg contingent who are always my stalwart supporters. I'd like to thank Aberystwyth University and HEFCW for investing time and funding in me and my project. And of course, the University of Wales Press. It's been such a pleasure to work with them. They've been so efficient and super helpful. And of course, Neil, down at the bottom, and Charlotte for accepting me into their book series. And Neil for he was super helpful in writing the book. Nearly done. I'd also like to thank Fernando Williams, who may be listening in from Patagonia, maybe, because he wrote the fantastic blurb on the back that made me blush. And of course the National Library of Wales for this event, organising the event and everything, and for you all for coming. So that's my thanks. And now
the question.
And now I have forgotten what the question is. But I believe it was something about how I came to be writing this book. Is that right?
This is a real political interview.
Oh no, I haven't got off on a complete tangent.
So, what was it that made you decide to actually research and write this?
Well, I mean, the genesis of the book really came because, as you said, I'm a Latin Americanist. I was working on Argentina, and I wanted to continue working in that same kind of vein. But I found that I didn't, because I had a family and we had the farm and everything, I didn't really want to go away for a long period of time. So I was thinking to myself, well, how can I continue working on Argentina? Sorry, is this making a horrible noise? Shall I? I could just hold it like this. Though I'm a bit of an arm waver, so it might not work quite so well, but I could try going like this. Is that a bit better, do you think? Okay. Yeah, it's up a bit. Is that okay? Oh, and the same for Paul, please. This is what I call techno traumas. We all have them, don't we? What was I saying? Oh, right, okay, yeah. So I wanted to continue, and I thought, hang on a minute. I speak Spanish, I speak Welsh, I'm right next door to the National Library of Wales. It would make complete sense for me to have a look at the archives of Wladfa'n. And I think in many ways it's because of I have this capacity to read all three of these languages and work in all three of these languages to a greater or lesser extent. Then I was really able to access the fantastic archives here, but also, because of my background in studying Argentina and my understanding of Argentine politics and society and the way things work in Argentina, this meant that I could bring a really fresh perspective to looking at Wladfa'n, one which is kind of inside, but also kind of outside as well. So looking at it from a different perspective was really important. I also think I bring some of that as well to looking at Wales, because I was born in Buxton, in sunny Derbyshire, in sunny Flash. So even though I've lived here for a long time, I have a great commitment to Wales, but nevertheless, my background is kind of outside of Wales. So I see Wales as well from a slightly fresh and distinctive perspective as well. And I think that's one of the things actually that has enriched the book. Coming at these things, as it were, from the margins, literally, in terms of me as well.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, the margins. The book, in a sense, begins in a very unconventional place. And for anyone who's familiar with the Welsh in Patagonia, it's a very disorientating place. It's not that it's badly written or anything, it's very clearly written, but it's not the place you would expect. Could you say something about why you started where you started?
Yeah, okay, so the book starts with a testimony that was taken from an indigenous person called Catrulaf, and it reflects on his experiences of encountering the Welsh, but his experiences are as an indigenous person who goes to trade, and he calls it Where the Welsh Are, and that's where the title of the chapter comes from. But it also talks about his experiences, and it locates him in his experiences of his encounter with the Argentine state and with the army, and his experiences of being interned in what is sometimes called concentration camps, certainly an internment camp, of having his family as it were, his social structure decimated, of being forced to go and serve in the army. So this is a very unconventional place to start, but I really wanted to start there in order to do two things, really. First of all, to sort of unsettle the usual narrative of a Wladfa'n, in 1865, blah-de-blah, kind of unsettle that story. But also, I really wanted to make a statement that centered the experiences of those on the receiving end of colonialism in Argentina, right at the very start, as it were, to place them at the beginning of the story, because of course they were on this land at the beginning, before the Welsh arrived, before the Argentinians arrived, before anybody arrived. So that was the reasoning, really.
Yeah, well, the sort of kind of familiar, popular version of European interaction with the Americas is the landing of the settlers, isn't it? And that's there too in the mythology about the Welsh in Patagonia. So that actually overturns that kind of starting point. And one of the things that strikes me about the book is that you seem to want to humanize individuals of all sorts. And is that a strategy that you adopted deliberately? Yes,
absolutely. I think I really wanted to break free of the stereotypes of the Welsh, and also of the stereotypes of Indigenous peoples. And I wanted to bring the human element in. And I think that one of the key moves associated with racism is to kind of objectify a person and treat them as an other, and not treat them as a human being. So I really wanted to bring that humanization in, particularly in relation to the Indigenous people. But also, when I was reading the archives here, the character and personality of the Welsh settlers really jumped out at me. These weren't just sort of stereotyped kind of virtuous people going to chapel. They were just as, mixed up and complicated as the rest of us. And I think a lot of that came out, really, particularly because my strategy, actually, for tackling this topic wasn't so much to sort of like read all the standard books and then look at the archive. I began that way, and I felt myself being kind of drawn into the usual story. And I thought, no, I don't want this. And so I just went straight then to the archives, and particularly to the diaries and journals of the people who were there. And not only was this super exciting, of course, to hold a diary that's been written by somebody in the middle of Patagonia, when as it were, the first Europeans to look at this place. But it really, as I say, the humanity of them jumped out. And so when I was writing the book, I tried to put in these little vignettes and little quirky things that I read in the archive, and I thought to myself, oh God, that's so funny, or that's so interesting, or that's so quirky, and like things like, I don't know, the names of the horses, or a joke that somebody played on somebody else. That kind of thing, I think, really helps to bring the people alive. And it also helps the reader, I hope, to connect with the Welsh in Patagonia in a different way, as well as connecting with the Indigenous people in a less stereotyped kind of a way as well. So it was part of my methodology in many ways, was to try and deliberately humanize. But I personally think it makes it a more interesting read when you get to know the people involved.
Yeah, it certainly is. And in a sense, that's one dimension of the book. There's another important dimension. It's signposted in the book's title, which is Settler Colonialism from the Margins. And there is this sort of big idea, if you could put it like that, underlying the book, which gives it its overall rationale. Could you explain a little about what you mean by settler colonialism from the margins?
Whew, okay, that's a humongous question.
Succinctly.
Well, I think, gosh, where to start? I think I'll start somewhere and then we'll see where we go. I think that's sort of my strategy anyway. Let's start with Wales, because I think that when I was approaching and thinking about Wales and colonialism, I felt quite frustrated because I felt as if the kinds of theories that had been used to try and understand Wales, they felt that they didn't really fit. Very often, and colonialism, very often they sort of tackled the sort of post-colonial theory. And post-colonial theory came out particularly of experiences of in India and those kinds of British imperial locations. But I felt it really didn't fit with Wales theoretically. And the theory chapter, I have to say, took me about 3 years to write. Off and on. I kept trying and then failing and then trying and failing and trying and failing. But then in the meantime, I'd become interested in settler colonial theory. And settler colonial theory emphasizes the idea that settlers, that colonialism is conducted by settlers who come to stay and who come to create a new society, and who aim to not to sort of just extract and then leave and go back home, but to really create something brand new. And I felt that that was appropriate to understanding Patagonia. And then I began to wonder whether it might also help us, in a sense, to understand Wales a bit better. Particularly, and that is to say, you know, I don't much like it when people, or how can I put this? I don't want to sort of start having arguments about, is Wales colonial, is it not, was it then, is it different now? I sometimes think that those kinds of discussions aren't particularly helpful. What I wanted to do was to identify processes associated with colonialism that I might be able to identify in operation in Patagonia, but also seem to me to have a resonance with experiences both in the past and now in Wales. And that's in no way to say that we're looking at the same kind of a scenario. And if you wanted to label Wales or Patagonia as colonial in some sense, then it's quite restricting. So what I wanted to do was identify these processes, and the processes I identified, and I think it kind of works a bit, but it's very much a work in progress, is possession not only in terms of taking land, but also a mentality of possessiveness, which is in the mind of the settler. And that came from a theorist from Australia. Racialization, and I say stroke barbarization, for reasons I'm not going to go into here because it's too theoretical and boring. But racialization, stroke barbarization, and assimilation. And I think that I offer these concepts as tools that other people might be able to use and deploy. Now, I've been going on a lot about theory, so I'm going to stop now.
I should add that the section on theory is, the 3 years was well spent because it's extremely clear and very stimulating, and does suggest all these different questions about Wales in the 19th century, Wales today, and I think it has much wider applicability. which I think is something very important. When we sort of think about the Welsh side of it, one of the things is the way in which Patagonia, Wladfa'n, has fitted into the way at least some aspects of Welsh society have seen themselves internationally. And you mentioned the empire there, the British Empire, and Patagonia, I think, almost gives Wales a pass. It sort of says, you know, we weren't part of all that. Well, we were, but it allows us to say, here is a moral action that we took. We were different. And that idea of Welsh morality is something that does come up here. How do you approach that?
Okay, I think I approach it I think I would say that Wladfa'n has a really iconic status in Welsh culture, society and politics, far larger than the settlement ever was. And this iconic status derives, I think, in part from this, the idea that this was a moral enterprise, or a more moral enterprise. And this certainly comes out in the archive. Seems to me to be how many of the protagonists in Wladfa'n felt about themselves, but also the way that people in sort of the 1910s, 1920s in their memoirs were writing about Wales. So this sense of moral agency is really important. It struck me that in a way, it's a way for these protagonists and for Wales to say, you know, we might not be the most powerful, we might not be the richest, but when it comes to colonization, we are the most moral actors. And morality, in the end, trumps everything else, kind of thing. It's a very empowering move to take on this mantle of morality. Now, I would say also that there is definitely more than a grain of truth in this, in that the Welsh did not engage only exceptionally in physical confrontation with the indigenous people. And they, sorry, moved my microphone. So there is more than a grain of truth in this. But it is used and exercised then, but I think still now today, as a way to assert virtue, and therefore to assert a sort of powerfulness that is not related to other forms of power, but this kind of moral power. I don't know whether I'm explaining this very well.
Yes, that's very clear.
I don't think so.
And it brings me on to your fascinating chapter about the myth of friendship between the Welsh and the indigenous people. And it seems to me that actually exemplifies what you've just been saying, that you've got what is in some senses a reality, but in other senses not. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think the relationships with the indigenous people sometimes were quite positive. There were genuine friendships, but quite often you can tell in the archive that there's a sense of sort of irritation or annoyance. There are also, I mean, and this is no surprise at all, Their attitude is clearly, they understand themselves to be superior to these savages, as it were. But this is, as I say, this is unsurprising. This is the middle of the 19th century. It would be astonishing if anybody was thinking in other ways. However, there are other instances where we see this becoming more fractious and more difficult. And that's what I'm meaning when I'm talking about sort of humanizing, in a sense, is to sort of look beyond the caricature, not to deny that some aspects of this caricature were true, that some people were very friendly, but other people certainly were not. And it would be amazing if you know, every Welsh person out there was morally virtuous and conducted themselves perfectly with Indigenous people. So yeah.
Well, it seems to me that one of the key points in all this is the different encounters of the different groups with the Argentine state. And I think you bring the Argentine state into this in important ways, with the conquest of the desert and so on. And then the trajectories of the Welsh and the indigenous people, they diverge in very obvious ways. So what happens to the Welsh at that stage?
Yeah, so when the conquest of the desert comes down, things become not very rosy at all in Patagonia. The conquest of the desert, for those who don't know, was the campaign of the Argentine military, which attempted to push, or did push, the indigenous people down to the south, if they encountered resistance in the way, then there were massacres. As I said, lots of people were rounded up in these concentration camps. And so for indigenous people, they were directly oppressed by the Argentine state. For the Welsh protested this to a certain extent, but this arrival of the Argentine state really forced the issue. And there's one very memorable moment when somebody says, you know, I lamented to see the indigenous people, he would call them the Indians, I lamented to see them being marched in front of me. And this is the point, you know, some people are cleared from the land. Some people are sent to internment camps. Other people are largely powerless and they stand at the side. And those people who are able to stand at the side, they are the ones that end up inheriting the land. They are the ones who end up being valued citizens, in actual fact. And it's this moment of divergence, two communities that up until then have been interlocking more or less peaceably. Then suddenly there's a divide. And that divide is created by the Argentine state. Mm-hmm. What also gets quite interesting, though, is that at the same, a little bit later, a few years later, then the Colonel Fontana comes down, and he is appointed by the Argentine state to rule over Patagonia. And he then demands that the Welsh give up their autonomy, as it were, or their aspirations towards autonomy, and that they too become under the tutelage of the Argentine state. Now, actually, the Argentine state has always wanted the Welsh to be just normal settlers. They said, we will give land to people, we give land to families, and that's it. We're not giving you a tract of land that you can then, declare independence on. And there's a whole lot of argy-bargy between all these, between Lewis Jones in particular, and the various different representatives of the state that come down and try to impose order. But that order is imposed by 1884 with the arrival of Fontana. But actually lots of Welsh people are still saying, no. In fact, Lewis Jones is sort of bridling against this, and they keep trying to push and trying to find spaces in which to exercise their power. It's not until 1899 that they finally give up the ghost for two reasons. One is a very abortive attempt to persuade the British government to intervene on behalf of the Welsh in Patagonia, which was never going to go anywhere. And the other was terrible floods in 1899. And then by then, everybody was just focused on rebuilding their houses, etc. They gave up.
It's interesting the way that Patagonia was central to a certain sort of national imagination in the 19th century. But in the early 20th century, it appeared to actually fade from the picture. And it's, in a sense, the late 20th century and now devolution that have turbocharged the whole idea, perhaps Welsh mythology of Patagonia. And you deal with that process in the book. Is there a sense in which this book couldn't have been written except in the context of devolution?
I think that's, for me, I don't know about my book, but I think it certainly frames it. When we're thinking about, let me start again. I think you're absolutely right that in the early 20th century, the Wladfa'n kind of got forgotten, and it became the focus came back on it in the early 1960s. There were a few really early documentaries and things like that, but also the work of Bryn Williams, who wrote a history of Wladfa'n, but also lots of children's books as well, that really galvanized interest in Wladfa'n. And this, particularly, the focal point for this was 1965, which was the centenary of the arrival of the Mimosa. And at that point, of course, Wales itself was undergoing a process of resurgence, cultural resurgence and resistance against assimilation, against the English state, as it were, the British state in many ways. So this is one of the reasons, I think, why then Wladfa'n becomes so important. So I'm going to move my microphone again. One of the reasons why it becomes so important is because it becomes an emblem in many ways of the capacity of Welshness to endure, even on the other side of the world, and its capacity to retain this kind of cultural strength and propose that cultural strength. So for me, this is a really important role of Wladfa'n in Welsh politics and society today, is that it kind of becomes emblematic of this resistance in many ways, and more importantly, maybe even a source of pride. It's something that we don't have many successes in Wales that have an unmitigated. Do you know what I mean? So this sense that there's a huge success, there's something to really celebrate, that even after 100 years, it still endures. And this is revitalizing, and it's energizing, and it's empowering in many ways. So I think it came out at that point, at that conjunction, really importantly. In terms of today, though, I think it still remains extremely important kind of touchstone or pivot point. I mean, we've got a lot of people signed up to come here. Yes. Everybody knows about Wladfa'n. Everybody studies it in school. And it remains an extremely important touchstone that still engenders a great deal of pride. But I think now is maybe a moment when we can begin to perhaps rethink and unpack a little bit of that mythology that's so important. Part of that context, I think, is devolution. In 1965, there was no political entity really that was particularly Welsh, apart from institutions such as this. It seems to me that Welshness was embodied in its cultural institutions and its everyday cultural practices of speaking, of the Eisteddfodau, of capel, a phorpeth. Now that it's become more institutionalized, there's a sense in which something, I think, has been definitely achieved, which is not going to go away. It strikes me as well that alongside that, the Welsh language, of course, is always under threat, but there's a much greater cultural confidence, I think, in Wales. It seems to me there's more cultural confidence. And given the empowerment that it doesn't just come from culture, and given the cultural confidence and the social confidence of being Welsh, I think this is a time when we can maybe begin to challenge some of the more cherished stories. Pardon me. And one of the ways that I think that I want to unpack that cherished story is by introducing the story of the Indigenous alongside the Welsh story. My aim is not to sort of condemn or be in some sense nasty about the Welsh and what they did. I don't see any point in that. The truth of their courage is still true. The truth of their ingenuity out there is still true. That doesn't go away. But what I'd like to do is introduce an extra story to this, to the narrative, to enrich the narrative, but also by introducing the Indigenous part of the story. I think it hopefully will spark some different ideas in people's heads, maybe invite people to look beyond the stereotypes, to look beyond the stereotypes of the Welsh and to look beyond the stereotypes of the Indigenous, to sort of take a slightly more critical look by introducing this extra story into the narrative. Mm-hmm. I feel like I've been talking for a long time. I hope great. You're not really bored.
one of the things that was going through my mind is you mentioned the centenary in 1965, but the 150th anniversary, as you showed quite clearly, occurred in a very, very different political circumstance. There was a first minister to travel to Patagonia. There were governmental relations, ambassadors, and so on. And it seems to me that devolution, like any political system, develops its own mythologies. It needs mythologies to sustain it. And that this was clearly becoming, on the 150th anniversary, one of those mythologies that was acceptable and interpreted in terms of a positive anti-racial agenda and so on. But I think you might say that there were problems with that.
I think, of course, politicians need to mobilise all the tools in their armoury, definitely. And this was a point of great celebration for the Argentine state as well. As I said, in Argentina, we have the story of the conquest of the desert, which is brutal, and which is, or should I say, was increasingly discredited. There's some bad things happening in Argentina at the moment, but it was at that time being disparaged and pulled apart. So for the Argentine state, they were really happy because, yes, we've got a story of settler colonialism that's positive. It's about friendship between the Welsh and the indigenous. And this was very much a part of the discourse of the Argentine state at the time. And for the Welsh as well, it wasn't so long since devolution had happened. This was definitely a momentous moment. Nobody from the UK had been in Argentina, I think, since the Falklands-Malvinas War. So this was a big moment, and it was fantastic for Carwyn. He got to shake hands with all these fantastic people, photo opportunities, etc. And really, there'd been not very much dissent, actually, about the romantic story up until that point. I think dissent about or sort of different perspectives on the romantic story only really emerged in the aftermath of that. One unusual critical voice that I found and discuss in the book is the fantastic anarchic film Separado. I don't know whether you've all seen it, but it's kind of crazy, and Griff Rhys is brilliant in it. But he goes to Patagonia. But one of the really important things he does is that he does reflect, quite briefly, but he does reflect on contemporary indigenous people and their position. But he also interviews a couple of political scientists, or are they sociologists? I can't quite remember. And they are talking about this sort of myth of friendship, and they are very critical of it. And really, that was the only voice that I've managed to find. I was very pleased when I saw that. Perhaps typical of Griff Rhys in his more controversial way of being and being fabulous. I don't know whether I've answered that question at all.
Yes, great. I mean, we've covered the past, the 19th century.
Yeah.
We've dealt with the present, but the book, in a sense, doesn't end there. It's also partly about the future. What are your views now about where this story should go?
In a way, I'm not quite sure that I am the person to say where this story should go. I can tell you about my project and what I'd like people to take from the book. So, I mean, one of the things I'd like to people to take from the book, it's in a way, it's sort of an invitation to think differently and maybe reconsider the usual stories. And this is part of what I would loosely call a kind of like a decolonial project. And that makes it sound very, very difficult. And you can make decolonial projects really difficult and testing and morally agonizing. But I think what I'd like to suggest is that people maybe try and find out a little bit more about the Welsh in Patagonia and their relationship to the indigenous people, to find out actually more about the indigenous people. Indeed, you know, our understanding of the indigenous people in Patagonia is very much focused on the past, but actually there are large and fairly well organised communities there who actually are under quite a lot of political difficulty at the moment. Indigenous people are being harassed in their own homes by the federal police. That happened only at the beginning of February. And at the beginning of January, a community were thrown off their land by the federal police with the accompaniment of the Minister of the Interior and the governor of Chubut province. They were accused of setting fires in the Los Alerces National Park. It's highly, highly unlikely that it was they who set the fires. This is a thing that happens right across Latin America, and usually the people behind it are people who want that land. Maybe they want the land for mining. Maybe they want the land for farming, or for other reasons. So there's a whole lot of politics going on out there in Patagonia, and but we don't really know very much about it. So one of the things that I would like to do is actually now with this to spend more time trying to raise awareness of the politics of what's happening to Indigenous people in Patagonia. In many ways to raise awareness and therefore to maybe make people think, well, the Welsh weren't directly colonising. They didn't directly, in many ways, sort of colonise. They weren't the Argentine army. The land was already earmarked by the Argentine state, and the Welsh were, as it were, given the land, even though it wasn't theirs to give. They were given the land by the Argentine state. But nevertheless, the Welsh settlement was the pioneer in Patagonia, and their mere presence and their interaction and their actions as settlers, particularly, I have to say, up in the Andean regions, means that even though this isn't necessarily, as it were, the fault of the Welsh, it's something to do with us. It's not something that's happening on the other side of the world that's nothing to do with us. And indeed, you know, this Welsh settlement, it was dreamed up by the Welsh, it was organised by the Welsh, it was financed by the Welsh, it was the people who went were Welsh, the people who did all the organising and settling were Welsh. So in a way, you know, this is our colony, even though it's not like the British Empire and all that. But to me, it seems that we have some sort of responsibility, or at least that is a discussion and a debate that we can have. Some people might feel that we do, some people might feel less so, but I think it's something that we need to talk about and discuss, and in the process learn more about the whole of that history, and not just the Welsh side of the history, but the whole of that history. So, but I was going to say something maybe about what I was going to do myself. And one of the things that I would like to do, well, I am doing, is that at the moment I'm running a kind of a pilot project. with 3 schools to try and develop some materials for schools, for primary schools, in order to help the teachers. I've spoken to a few teachers and they say, oh, I'd love to do some more of this, but I just don't know anything about it. There are no resources that I can use. How can I do this? So I'm working with 3 schools to try and, because obviously I am not a primary school teacher, so I need to work with some actual primary school teachers in order to make materials that are going to be useful and suitable for them. Try it out with the children, see how the children respond, and then maybe from that pilot project, if it works, if it's okay, try and get some money and then sort of create a package of resources that then teachers can use. One of the things about decolonial action is that it's supposed to have action. You know, you're supposed to do something. You know, I'm just me, but I think it's no use just sitting there and thinking, oh, this is terrible. Oh, I shouldn't. You know, the question is, well, what should we do? What practical things can we do? I would love to be able to, for example, invite some Indigenous people to come over, maybe some artisans, some practitioners of weaving or painting or poetry or what have you, to come over, because I think there's nothing like actually meeting a real person, getting back to this humanization thing. And there's nothing like meeting a real person and hearing the story from their mouth to be able to do something. And also really like maybe to go out and to do some filming, to make a film, or maybe just interviews with people. Actually, there's somebody called Geraldine Lublin who's also working with the National Library of Wales. And she's done some brilliant work with Indigenous communities in the Andean region. And I believe she's going to be presenting that work sometime over the summer, maybe here. So keep an eye out for that. So there are people who are doing things.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Just in case you didn't know, Lucy's written a book. It's called Global Politics of Welsh Patagonia, Settler Colonialism from the Margins. And I can tell you that there are new insights and stimulating insights on every page. It's for sale outside. You can buy it there. Although Christmas isn't coming, you can plan ahead and, you know.
Ideal holiday reading. No.
And it's extremely clearly and succinctly written, so I do recommend it. I think we really should thank Lucy.
Just before we do, just to say that outside there's a post-it board. There's a board with some post-its. So and the question is, I can't remember now. What should we do now? So having heard this, I'd really like to know what you think we should do now. Whether we should do nothing, whether we should read more, whether we should. But you might have ideas about, I don't know, cultural exchange or something like that. So if you feel moved to, then please do share your ideas with me there, and that would be great. And for people online, they can email me if they have a burning thing that they want to say. They can email me on lft@aba.ac.uk, and I would love to hear from you online.
Great. Thanks very much, Lucy. And thank you very much for your contributions tonight. Thank you. Excellent.
That conversation so expertly. That was fantastic. Thank you, Paul.
That's okay.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Paul. Yes, thank you both for a fascinating discussion and an invitation to think differently, and I think that that's a really, really important challenge and a challenge to action as well. Just before we finish, this event is a part of a series of events that we have here at the library and online. I'd just like to draw your attention just a couple of upcoming events that we have as part of the programme. We have an event, guided tours of the exhibition, of the main exhibition that we have here at the moment, under the title No Welsh Art. And that's taking place on the first Wednesday of the month at 1 o'clock and 3 p.m. We're also going to be looking at challenging the energy consensus with Professor Gareth Wyn-Jones on the 11th of April. And then we have a launch of an exciting new literary magazine, Folding Rock magazine, here on the 15th of April at 7 o'clock. So keep a lookout for those, and you can register online via our website. So with those words, I'd like you to thank Lucy and Paul very much, and hope you have an enjoyable evening. Diolch yn fawr iawn.